Hey y'all, welcome to the Southern Appalachian Herbal Podcast. I'm Judson Carroll and I'm an herbalist. I'm also a wild crafter, a gardener, and herb grower. I'm coming to you from high atop the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, just a stone's throw from the Tennessee line, overlooking the Pisgah National Forest. Absolutely surrounded by the bounty of God's green earth. I spent most of my life wandering these mountains and learning about plants from the old timers and all sorts of characters. On this show, we'll talk about herbs and how to use them, how to find them, how to grow them, how to make preparations. We'll talk about a lot of things. We can also talk about permaculture, homesteading, foraging, and living off the land. Most anything, really. You can email me at southern-appalachian-herbs@gmail.com if you have a question or a comment. You can also contact me through the Grow Network, where I'm a regular contributor and a moderator for the forums. And my blog is, of course, southern-appalachian-herbs@blogspot.com. All right, y'all. I'm going to sit my guitar down and let's talk about herbs. Hey, y'all. Welcome to this week's show. A beautiful, warm, sunny day here in March. I hope it's as pretty as where you are. It's pretty rare to have weather this warm in March. I may have to go ahead and plant some radishes and maybe some carrots and spinach at the very least, even though our last frost date really isn't until May. So it's still quite a bit before spring comes to my area, but I just cannot believe how warm it is. I hope it stays this way. Uh, if this is global warming, I'll take it. You know what I mean? So in today's show, I'd like to finish up our series on the history and practice of Christian herbal medicine, as detailed in my book by the same title, History and Practice of Christian Herbal Medicine by Judson Carroll. You can get it off of my blog in ebook form or off of Amazon in ebook or print. So, last week we kind of got up into the 1500s. We finished up with Paracelsus, who really kind of culminated the whole monastic medicine tradition. Now we're going to move into the Protestant era. Now, as I've kind of mentioned before, the so-called Reformation was very different in England than it was in most other countries. For instance, in Germany, when Martin Luther founded the Lutheran Church, it did not displace the Catholic Church. The Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church just became two churches side by side in Germany. In some regions, certain parts of Italy and such, the kings of those countries were Catholic, and they viewed a Protestant church as undermining their authority, and they would, persecute that church. In other areas, other nations where people were a little more open-minded, they got along just fine. The big difference between England and all those other European countries was that their Protestant movement really had no doctrinal basis behind it. They were not leaving the Catholic Church because they believed the Catholic Church to be wrong or corrupt or anything like that at all. They had a king, and he really sort of a really horrible person. I mean, he was an alcoholic, a bully, a murderer. I mean, he had trouble conceiving a son, so he kept divorcing his wives, and the church, of course, did not allow divorce, so he just would have them thrown in jail and then cut their heads off. So he's a really bad guy. Um, when the Pope basically said, "That's it. You cannot do this anymore. The church has more authority than a king of a nation, and you have to stop." Well, he just decided to form his own church. So I used to have an Anglican professor who would always joke that the Anglican Church is founded on divorce, and it actually is. There was no impetus to found that church. Anyway, I want to make clear that I'm not criticizing the modern Anglican Church. I'm not criticizing the historic Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is actually in very close communion with the Catholic Church because there are basically no doctrinal differences, other than that king declared himself head of the church. And in so doing, he said that anyone who did not renounce Catholicism and become Anglican was guilty of treason. This was so different than most everywhere else. Okay. He had, you probably heard of Cromwell. Cromwell went around executing priests, monks, and nuns. Anyone who did not swear allegiance to the king and renounce the Catholic Church was summarily executed. They killed thousands of people. I mean, I'm actually talking about my family here. I mean, I'm directly descended from King Richard Lionheart, King Edward the Confessor, and all that, the Catholic kings of England. So at that time, the upper class of England, the educated men, and the people with land and money were Catholic, and many of them refused to convert. And they were executed and their land confiscated. All the old churches in England used to be Catholic churches. Their priests were killed. All the, like you've seen Downton Abbey, yeah, that there were places that were actual abbeys. Abbeys are where nuns live, or monasteries. They slaughtered everybody and took the land. And if you were a wealthy landowner, it's sort of like the carpetbaggers that came in to the South after the Civil War. It was really profitable for them to accuse someone of treason and have them killed and take their land. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, it's really a pivotal point in the history of herbal medicine because up until this point, all the doctors, all the pharmacists, all the apothecaries, all the educated men and women, all the people who spoke Latin, all the people that had, university educations were Catholic. And in this period of time of great bloodshed and turmoil, most of them were killed. You may have seen the movie A Man for All Seasons. It's about St. Thomas More, then known as Sir Thomas More. He was considered to be the greatest legal mind in England and perhaps the greatest legal mind of all time. He was so incredibly respected in England that he was a specific target of the crown. He was put in prison and they didn't behead him for a while because if they could convince him to convert and get him to make sort of a legal case, a legal and somewhat theological case, because he was also very educated in theology, it would have been a huge influence in converting all of England. Well, his friends who had sold out converted. A few members of his family. There's this great scene in the movie. You may remember it if you've ever seen it. If not, definitely watch that movie. It's a great movie, classic, Oscar award-winning movie. His nephew says, "Uncle, why are you in prison? Why are you in there?" And he, after standing there and saying nothing, listening to these, what he considered hypocrites berate him, he turns and says, "The question is not why I am in here. The question is why you are out there." So, the great minds of England and the wealthy, the landowners, and all that, many of them killed. Okay, what that did was it kind of turned the world of medicine in England on its head. Like I said, this, say, middle class, like what we might call carpetbaggers, had suddenly taken over the property and the wealth of all these wealthy men, and their sons could now go to school. Um, the colleges, the universities that had been run by the Catholic Church were now run by the Anglican Church. So you were new professors, there were new students, a whole different class took over. You know, what happened though, it was very important because this new force came into society. They were throwing out most anything that had anything to do with Catholicism. That included many of the herbal books and texts. New books had to be written. There was one great herbalist. He was considered to be the finest herbalist and doctor in England and probably in the world at the time. His name was John Parkinson, and he was the king's physician. He was one of the few Catholics that did not renounce the church that was allowed to live because he was so valuable as a doctor. And he wrote a book called Paradisi in Soleil. It means like paradise in the soil or the sun. I can't remember, sun or soil. Soil would be humus. Okay, here's our little 2 minute Latin lesson for the day. You've heard of humus? That's like the soil in the woods full of leaves. Well, humi is soil or terra is land, okay? And soleil would be sun. So, all right, so this is Paradise in the Sun, subtitle Garden of Pleasant Flowers. It's actually a very, very long title and almost impossible to find an in-print copy. I don't know why. He wrote actually two books, and they were considered to be the finest botanical texts of the day and the finest herbal books, the finest medical books of the 1500s, and absolute classics. He had a beautiful garden and everything, and perhaps it was because he did not renounce Catholicism that his books were not as respected later on. Whereas the next man who comes along is John Gerard. John Gerard was one of these new men. He was from a middle class background. His Latin was not very good. He did not have a good grasp of Latin. But he wrote a wonderful herbal, Gerard's Herbal. It remains in print. It's absolutely classic, even though it turns out he plagiarized much of it, a Dutch botanist, and it was full of flaws. I mean, he mislabeled plants. He not only, copied and plagiarized, but he wasn't as educated a man as, say, John Parkinson. He was one of these new men. And, he was an Anglican, he was a Protestant, and he became basically the head gardener and plant collector in all of England. Now, his book is beautiful. I mean, I love it. I have it on my shelf. It's written in Elizabethan English. He was a friend with William Shakespeare. He had a vast garden that he managed for the Queen that had plants from all over what was in the British Empire. And a lot of Shakespeare's plays were probably written right there under the, huge walnut and oak trees and all the flowers. So when you read like A Midsummer Night's Dream and you see those scenes in the woods, those were probably actually written in John Gerard's garden, and which is really cool when you think about it. But anyway, Gerard's Herbal is fantastic. And you can get a cheap paperback copy of it used off of eBay or Amazon or wherever you choose to buy it for probably $3 or $4. And it's if you read, the stuff Shakespeare wrote, it's not that hard to read. And it is just beautifully written. The whole thing is just incredibly poetic. But you have to remember, this was the break, okay? Whereas John Parkinson had preserved all that knowledge passed down through the monasteries and the universities for at that point in time, what, 1,000 years of Catholic history. uh, John Gerard is the break. He's the first Protestant herbalist in England. His remedies are wonderful, and as I said, they were mostly came from a very well educated and respected botanist who was Dutch. So it's a solid book. I definitely recommend it. Now, after this comes the figure Nicholas Culpeper. He is as controversial in Protestant herbalism as Paracelsus was in Catholic herbalism. Remember how I said last week when I get to Culpeper, you're going to see a lot of correlations between those two men. Well, first of all, remember I told you Paracelsus was short, stocky, pug-nosed, bandy-legged. Nicholas Culpeper was like almost elfin. He was a small-framed man with very, small, fine features and a pugnacious or puckish sense of humor. He was also a total rebel, just like Paracelsus. As I mentioned last week, Paracelsus shocked the entire Germanic speaking world when instead of as a professor teaching in Latin only, so only educated people can understand him, he spoke in German. Nicholas Culpeper did the same thing in England. Culpeper came from let's say a fairly upper middle class background, very Protestant, actually very anti-Catholic. Is if you get an old copy of his book, Culpeper's Herbal, before the modern versions came out, let's say since 1950, is full of absolute say vitriol toward Catholics and the Catholic Church. He's always condemning papists and our superstitious beliefs and everything. He was very, very anti-Catholic. In the newer translations, that's all left out. So I think it's definitely worthwhile to get an old translation just so you have history as it was written. I don't like whitewashing history. But Culpeper was very intelligent. He was very controversial. He apprenticed as an apothecary. There were guilds at this time. Remember, again, going back to Paracelsus, I told you the main conflict with him and everyone who condemned him was that at that time you had guilds. They were like unions, and he was undermining them. He was teaching people how to make their own medicine rather than having to buy it from a licensed pharmacy. He was treating people for free, oftentimes, rather than them having to pay a guild registered doctor. Well, Culpeper, again, like Paracelsus, looked at the apothecaries, the pharmacies of the day, and realized that a lot of the medicines, especially the patented formulas, counterfeit. And he wanted people to be able to make their own medicine. So he absolutely upset everyone in England by taking the pharmacy manuals, the pharmacopoeias, the apothecaries' manuals, and translating them from Latin into English so the average person would be able to read and know how to use herbs. That was a huge deal at the time. I mean, he was condemned by doctors, pharmacists, the people who bought and sold herbs to the pharmacies, politicians, the I mean, he was accused of witchcraft and sorcery. I mean, this was the time when they were dragging people out and burning them at the stake for witchcraft. Okay, and so they accused him of witchcraft. They wanted to get rid of this guy. Now he had a really mischievous sense of humor. He was very interested in astrology. He believed in astrology. His whole family had believed in astrology for generations. He could have been obviously condemned for sorcery or witchcraft just based on his writings on astrology. So as he was being accused of all these, horrible things, he decided to, in his herbal book, dedicate every single herb to an astrological sign and incorporate all kinds of, astrological mythology into his work, probably just to tweak the people of his day, just to really shove it in their face. And he did so with actually a good deal of humor. He makes several jokes in his book. Actually ended up fighting in the English Civil War on the wrong side of history, you might say. His side lost, and he was shot and wounded in battle and died later at a fairly young age. I believe he was only in his early 30s, but he did write two or three works during that time, and they are excellent herbals. They are a full culmination of all, along with Gerard. If you have those two books, you know everything basically about herbal medicine in 1500s to Culpeper's time, which is about mid 1600s. Now, the other thing that's really interesting about this time was this was when the British Empire was expanding. During my ancestors' time, the only reason they left England was to go fight in the Crusades. I mean, King Richard Lionheart kept the Muslims from invading all of Europe and converting everybody by the sword. Pretty noble guy, right? Well, the English of the 1600s, their expansionism was colonialism. They were going off and they were colonizing places like India and America and such as that, and oftentimes pretty violently, just uh, subjugating people and taking what they had. I mean, after they got through enslaving Ireland and moving half the population of Ireland out of Ireland and trying to starve the rest of them to death because Ireland would not submit to, again, England and the Anglican Church. Started going around and just doing that to everybody. It kind of became the British thing after a point. In 15, 16, 1700s, right? Became the empire. The English flag flew in every corner of the globe. Well, that was also, as tragic as that was, an incredible opportunity to learn about new plants and to gather plants. Men like Parkinson and Gerard became great plant collectors. In the Elizabethan era, they had just grand gardens. I mean, that's when a lot of the really great gardens in England got going, and really into the Victorian times. I mean, the English became plant obsessed. John James Audubon came to America and he began collecting plants. He began drawing birds and plants and fish, and the demand for his work in England was amazing. I mean, his books would be bought up years in advance. And that was the time when they began learning about new herbs. This is when we begin to see herbs like ginseng and golden seal, American herbs introduced into European medicine. And also, as they traveled the world, they encountered new diseases. And as they encountered new diseases, they encountered new cures for diseases from the natives wherever they ended up. England was not the only country doing this at the time, obviously. Spain was absolutely England's rival in terms of colonization. And what the Spanish did, they were still being Catholic, they would take a priest with them everywhere they went so their soldiers could have, mass once a week. So when the Spanish colonized South America, malaria was a huge problem. And the Jesuits that went with them discovered cinchona. That's the tree from which we get quinine. There are actually several sources of quinine, but cinchona was the main source. Now, no one really knows if the natives showed the Jesuits the use of cinchona. That is likely what happened. There's also a legend that a branch of cinchona had just fallen in a pool of water, and someone suffering from malaria took a drink of that water, and their fever subsided. However, it happened. Maybe that's actually how the natives discovered cinchona hundreds of years earlier, and that story just got retold. Who knows? But Jesuits introduced cinchona into European medicine, giving us quinine, the ancestor to chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine and all that. Um, but in England, they've refused to use it for the most part. You will read the British herbals from, 15, 16, 1700s, and they absolutely would omit the use of quinine because at that time it was being sold by the Spanish under the name Jesuit's bark. And at that point in time, England was so anti-Catholic that they would not even write down that word. Could not even write Jesuit's bark. Eventually, the Spain and the Jesuits lost their, I guess you would almost call it a monopoly, and other people started manufacturing quinine, and England totally embraced it, putting it in water that became the gin and tonic, the first cocktail. As these sailors were traveling the world, they were getting scurvy. They didn't have fresh vitamin C rich fruits and vegetables until they started carrying limes with them. The tonic water that contains quinine was good for the malaria they're picking up everywhere. Gin infused with juniper berries is antiviral and gives you a little bit of vitamin C depending on what herbs and fruits it's infused with. There are so many old recipes for infused gins. So it was just a matter of time before one of these limeys, one of these sailors that carried limes with them, took a little bit of tonic water and a little bit of gin and a slice of lime and came up with one of the world's greatest cocktails. So that is how medicine stood coming into the 1700s. And really, the best way, if you want to just get one book, well, it's actually a series of two books, but if you want to get books by one author, sums up the entire English folk medicine and the remnants of monastic medicine going into the colonial era, really up till 1930s England. Maud Grieve, A Modern Herbal. She wrote in two volumes in World War I because people in England needed herbal medicine. And it's an absolute classic. She quotes from Gerard, she quotes from Culpeper, she quotes from the old Greeks, Galen and Dioscorides and all that. She quotes folk medicine of not only England but France, and she talks about these new herbs that were now being imported from the Americas and from Asia and India and all that. So excellent works. If I only had one English herbal on my shelf, it would absolutely be Maud Grieve, A Modern Herbal. So now we're up to colonial times, right? These were very, obviously, very much British colonies. In North Carolina, it was illegal to be Catholic. It was in most of America. This whole notion that people came to America for religious freedom, the whole pilgrims up in New England, not really true. No, not really true at all. Most people came here for land, for property, for economic opportunity. We're at a point in time where all commerce is sending exports back to England and the other European nations that had the colonies. The main trade was in furs. America was essentially settled by fur trappers. The next thing was gathering wild plants. This started a huge industry. When the settlers discovered sassafras, especially, sassafras became so popular in England, they were shipping back just whole ships of sassafras to England. And people made a fortune just off of sassafras. When they discovered ginseng, it became the absolute rage. Ginseng is actually what opened up trade to China. China was a completely closed nation. They would not allow any trade with any American or European nation. They wanted nothing to do with white folks, trust me. We sent a ship over there full of ginseng. I mean, an entire, at the time, cargo ship full of tons and tons of ginseng and set it like basically out in the port. And when their military came out, they said, look, we've got a ship full of ginseng. You want to open trade to us now? Of course, the Chinese, being absolutely crazy about ginseng, opened up trade to the West, thanks to herbs being shipped from America. This was just huge. I mean, you could go, the country was open. A lot of the Native American tribes, the Cherokees, Catawbas, they made their living. The Iroquois made their living actually collecting these herbs, trading them to white traders who would then sell them on to herb companies. Everybody was going out in the woods collecting herbs, and it was just an incredible time of discovering new medicines, new plants, and that necessitated a whole new pharmacopoeia that included American herbs. And when we get into American herbal medicine, we really get into two schools after sort of the break with England. The first is really eclectic medicine. Now, the name actually kind of tells you what it was all about. There was a fellow named Constantine Samuel Rafinesque. He was American, but of French heritage and educated partially in France. He was a friend of Audubon, and he was a self-educated man. He didn't always get things right, sort of like John Gerard, or hey, sort of like me. I'm self-educated too. Um, so sometimes Audubon kind of had a little fun with him, told him he had seen plants that didn't exist. His eclectic school meant combining these different traditions. He knew basically everything about European herbal medicine. He taught himself Latin, he taught himself Greek, he knew everything about botany, he knew everything about medicine of the day. And he merged the European and British tradition of herbal medicine with the now Native American tradition, the herbs that are native to America, and what he could learn from Native Americans. And bringing those traditions of different European backgrounds together with Native American backgrounds and what the settlers had learned living here, the colonists, he came up with a school of eclectic medicine. Now, eclectic medicine is very interesting. It's a uniquely American school of herbal medicine, and at times was very controversial. Very controversial. A lot has been written, true or not, about Rafinesque. Some doctors said that he overused maidenhair fern and that he died of cancer due to that. Who knows if that's true or not? That could have just been a way to smear the eclectic medicine school. They were also involved in a body theft one time. They actually stole a body to take to one of their schools and do an autopsy on it. Obviously to better understand human anatomy. And some of them went to jail for that. Obviously, you can't go around stealing bodies. So a lot of interesting, colorful history with the eclectics. Eventually, eclectic medicine essentially merged with the more popular Thomsonian medicine. Now, Thomsonian medicine was founded by a man named Thompson. He was from way out, like in the middle of nowhere, and I think he was from New Hampshire, but he grew up in a very, very rural area, very way out in the woods, where herbal medicine was essentially the only medicine they had. He learned some from a local herbalist, He, as a child, learned the power of lobelia to help one throw up, to vomit. At the age of 21, Samuel Thompson's father left for Vermont, placing Samuel in charge of the farm, leaving his mother and sister in his care. Soon after, the mother became ill with measles, and in spite of the efforts of several doctors, Samuel's mother died when the measles turned into galloping consumption, was what it was called. Samuel, this is the man who founded Thompsonian medicine, also became ill with measles, but cured himself with herbal remedies. A year later, he married Susan Allen, and they had their first child. She became very ill, and several doctors could not cure her. Samuel Thompson arranged for two root doctors, which is what they called herbalists at the time, to treat his wife, and she returned to health in a day. So he became a very strong believer in herbs and developed a very strong dislike and distrust of doctors. At the time, medical practice was completely unregulated in America. So Samuel Thompson, just like Rafinescu, men of no real formal education, not licensed doctors, not having been to medical school or anything, started their own schools of medicine. And eventually the Thompsonian and the eclectic fairly merged. Thompson was a Unitarian. He was very religious in his writings. Okay, he's a very good representation of the 1700s in America, what people thought, and early 1800s. And his medical school, which was very geared toward the common man, it was absolutely embraced by rural people and more lower class, economically lower class people throughout America, which of course at the time was the majority. And it actually rivaled the professional doctors and the medical schools to the point that they tried to put him out of business. Obviously, I mean, people were not going to doctors in America anymore. They were going to Thompsonian herbalists. And eventually, the doctors brought suit against Thompson. In 1809, he was accused of killing a patient through the administration of excessive amounts of lobelia. We went to court. It was a hugely publicized trial. I mean, this was front page news every day for months. Eventually, it turned out the doctor who treated the patient was not officially licensed, we would say, officially mandated by Thompson. He used a counterfeit formula, and it probably didn't even have lobelia in it. So the courts found Thompson absolutely not guilty. Thompsonian medicine went on until the doctors were able to put him out of business through the law. They were able to pay off enough politicians, lobby and influence enough politicians to pass black laws against herbal medicine. This is the beginning in America when we begin to see restrictions on herbal medicine. What really it kind of came down to, if you look at the historians, again, it was that guild system. It also had a lot to do with the Masonic order. The doctors were Masons, and the politicians were Masons, and Thompson was not a Mason, and he wrote about his distrust of the Masons, and they were able to influence laws through the Masonic order to outlaw herbal medicine in America. And that eventually leads to the Pure Foods and Drug Act of 1906. And that's when herbal medicine, the practice, was essentially outlawed in most of America. You know, it actually, for a good period of time, was pretty much illegal to practice herbal medicine in America. It continued really in rural communities. It continued in the Appalachian Mountains where I live. It continued with midwives. But even in the 1990s, there were health food stores. I know because I worked at one of them. We were not raided, but other health food stores were raided by armed federal officials for selling herbal medicine, or the way their vitamin supplements and herbal supplements were labeled. But that is kind of where herbalism in America was in the 1800s. Now, in Germany, there was an absolute revolution going on. There was a priest that I've spoken about before. His name was Father Nape. Father Nape developed tuberculosis while he was in seminary. and the doctors could not do a thing for him. He was dying. He found a book about bathing in cold water to strengthen the system, to invigorate the system, to strengthen the immune system and the lungs. And he developed what he would call his water cure. He completely healed himself, basically swimming in a cold river and walking barefoot in the snow. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but this is the foundation of German folk medicine, and it actually does work. I mean, German folk medicine is really one of the only schools of natural medicine to be proven in courts of law to be effective. So you can pick up a copy of The Water Cure, My Water Cure by Father Nate, that this day in English. It's still in print. He included the herbs passed down through the monastic tradition and the German folk medicine. So he's got a full herbal and a full system of curing yourself with cold water and sleeping with the windows open and taking hikes. His book in about 1890 became the world's bestseller. I mean, it was only outsold by the Bible. It was translated into so many languages. Just about everybody would have had a copy of Father Nape's My Water Cure. Father Nape had a protege named Brother Aloysius. Brother Aloysius wrote a book around 1900. I think it's out of print at this time, but look for Brother Aloysius. You can probably find a copy of it used. He included the full herbal tradition. Father Nape said, "What I'm doing with water, you can do with herbs. You write about the herbs." And the two of them actually ran uh, spas, I mean, treatment centers. People came from all over the world to be healed of a variety of conditions using the Nape water cure. And those facilities still exist to this day. When I co-wrote the book on Father Kunzel with Jolanta Whitted, she was telling me all about, how they still practice the Nape water cure in the Alps. And Maria Trebin wrote extensively about how she would go annually for her spa treatment at one of the Nape centers. They have specific diets. The herbal practitioners give them specific herbs. They take hikes in the mountains. They bathe in cold water, the whole bit. So, I mean, this still goes on to this day. Father Johann Kunzel was Swiss. He was very influenced by the monastic and the Germanic folk medicine. Big fan of Father Nape. He references him many times in his book. He came out with his book, Herbs and Weeds. All these men really wanted to take the tradition of monastic medicine, German folk medicine, and make it available to the common person. Father Nape was absolutely adamant about every house having its own little herbal cabinet, and the members teach the children how to go out and gather the plants. The mother administers the teas to the children. People treating themselves because people were very poor at the time, and he not only believed this was more effective than going to doctors. He had no faith in doctors or pharmacies, and but he also wanted to help poor people. And so did Father Kunzel, to the extent that Father Kunzel wrote this small pamphlet, Herbs and Weeds. It was barely more than 20 some pages long. And it would have been absolutely common in any German speaking household in Europe and would have become a great bestseller had it not been for the World Wars when, in England or America, no one would dare have a German language publication in their house for fear that someone would accuse them of being, a Nazi sympathizer or, a German sympathizer. Even, Germanic speaking communities in America stopped speaking German at that point. And they even quit calling hamburgers hamburgers because, Hamburg is a city. They came up with all kinds of different names for them, kind of like we did with Freedom Fries, back in the Gulf War, or I guess it was after 9/11. So Father Kunzel became so popular. I mean, following on Father Nape's success, Father Kunzel was really promoting people treating themselves with herbs to the extent that, just like here in America with the Thompsonian and eclectic medicine, the medical profession was threatened. People were not going to doctors anymore. Father Kunzel was brought up on charges, essentially practicing medicine without a license. He went into the courts and he proved that he could treat diabetes better with his herbs than the doctors could with their pharmaceuticals. That legalized herbal medicine in most of the German-speaking world. That proved the efficacy of monastic medicine, German folk medicine. And so, for that period of time where herbalism was essentially being stamped out and made illegal in America, when it was being looked down upon in England, If you were an educated man, you went to a licensed doctor, you looked at herbal medicine as superstition. To this day, much writing about herbal medicine in England is done derisively. Just uneducated country people, kitchen witches, witchcraft and superstition. Apparently, that's all many people think herbalists are. But in the Germanic speaking world, herbal medicine was now legal and formalized, and it preserved much of what we know today and use today, thanks to the actions of a few very brave priests and one monk. Oh, and at the same time, in the Soviet Union, the Russians are very proud of their culture, but it's a very poor country. It was especially poor in the Soviet era. The Soviet government put a ton of money and emphasis in researching Russian herbal medicine. And likewise, the Chinese government, very proud of their culture and their traditional Chinese medicine. So in the Western world, everything west of Germany into America, herbalism was getting pushed out and made illegal. And from Germany into Russia and China and India with Ayurveda, it was being preserved. In America, uh, things went on. Obviously, by the 1950s, there were very few herbalists. Unless you were in the Appalachian Mountains, unless you were in a Mennonite or an Amish community, unless you were somewhere where someone had access to a midwife, you weren't using herbs. A lot of the Native Americans continued to use herbs. Some tribes actually don't have an herbal tradition. That surprises a lot of people. But those that did, oftentimes very poor, continued to use herbs. And a lot of the coastal black communities, African American communities, they had an herbal tradition of their own that unfortunately has largely been lost because it just really was not documented as well as it should have been. But by, 1950s, herbalism was almost dead in America. After the World Wars, as America was becoming more urbanized and the countryside was becoming suburbanized and people weren't out hiking and camping and hunting and fishing anymore, they were playing golf if they were doing anything in the outdoors. Obviously, there was going to be a backlash against that. Three figures really arise that started sort of the back to the land movement. The first is my hero that I've talked about so many times, George Leonard Herder. George L. Herder and Herder's Waseka. It was the predecessor to, say, Bass Pro Shops or Outdoor World. If you ever watch Last Man Standing, I am pretty sure the whole outdoor man character is based on George Herder. He ranted about everything. He was very libertarian, very, very conservative socially. He was a devout Catholic and very my kind of guy, But he had a very sharp wit, a very biting sense of humor. He wrote so many books. The man wrote, he did it over years. He wrote dozens of books, 300 and 400 pages long, including the classic cookbook series, The Bull Cook. He also wrote the Professional Guides Manual. Professional Guides Manual tells anyone how to go into the woods and set up camp, how to treat first aid situations, how to forage. He did not write a lot about herbs, but he did write a lot about edible plants. He wrote a tremendous book called How to Get Out of the Rat Race and Live on $10 a Month. Wild foraging for food and herbs was very much a part of that mindset. He encouraged people at the time, just pack up and go to Alaska, build yourself a cabin with an axe. He taught people the proper way to sharpen an axe, proper way to use an axe, the proper way to build a cabin. He had, a very detailed opinion on just about everything, and just live off the land. And that's how you, in the 1960s, 50s, could have lived on $10 a month. Inflation's hit us pretty hard. I don't think we could live on $10 a day in most places. Um, you know, I can, but most people don't live my lifestyle. He was the first, and as I said, George Herder's books are just classic. You should at least have a copy of The Bull Cook on your shelf. It's a wonderful book. It's full of stories that he just made up on the spot, just because he had a odd sense of humor and a lot of fun, and some excellent recipes. The next is Bradford Angier. Bradford Angier was also an outdoor writer. He wrote books, much like Herder, about going to the woods, building your own cabin. Um, he kind of took some other people's ideas sometimes. He wasn't really, it was a little controversial, but he wrote two really good books you should definitely have. one on foraging for wild edibles, but the other one on foraging for wild medicinal herbs. He wrote a whole book, one of the first and best books in modern America. I think he published this in the 60s on going to the woods, finding the herbs you need, and how to use them. Bradford Angier, absolutely excellent. And then the third is the one everyone's heard of, Eull Gibbons. Eull Gibbons came, about 10 years after those guys. Eull Gibbons, what a character he was. You may, I mean, if you're old enough, if you're my age or older, you may remember him doing grape nuts commercials. He was a celebrity. I mean, he was on all the talk shows. He was on with Johnny Carson, and he was on with, everybody talking about his books and his lifestyle of living off the land. The man did not want to do anything more than wander the woods, gather wild plants, fish. He was considered to be, just a layabout, but, I can certainly understand that. That is, to me, is the ideal lifestyle if you can make a living writing books and wandering the woods and living off the land. No, that's what he did. He studied botany. He learned about the plants, and he started writing books like Stalking the Wild Asparagus, all about foraging for wild foods. He wrote another excellent book called Stalking the Healthful Herbs. Eull Gibbons is kind of an interesting character. He was an avowed communist who eventually realized just how evil communism is and became a Quaker. So again, we've got a Christian herbalist that was very influential, although I would say he was probably more nominally Quaker than, actual believing and practicing, but, just based on some of the things that he wrote. But he loved Christmas. The man absolutely loved Christmas and Easter. So uh, funny, interesting character, great wit, and seemed to have a big heart and pretty good guy. But that book, Stalking the Helpful Herb, is really what got herbalism going again in large part in America in the 1960s. When the hippies decided to go out in the woods and learn to live off the land, they took with them a book by Bradford Angier, a book by Eull Gibbons, Stalking the Healthful Herb, Stalking the Wild Asparagus. Actually, one of my favorite books that he did is Stalking the Blue-Eyed Scallop. It's how he could find seafood just about everywhere he went, all kinds of odd things you wouldn't think about eating. And I took his book to the beach with me a couple of times and went out into the salt flats and everything and started looking for some of the odd things that most people don't eat that turned out to be really delicious, absolutely delicious. And they would take with them more than likely a George L. Herbert book. So armed with those books, the hippies went out in the woods and they became the herbalists that began writing in the 70s and 80s. They were the Susan Weeds and the Rosemary Gladstars and the Michael Moores and, Howie and all those guys, Seven Song, that teach today and that we know today and that we learn from. Unfortunately, that breakdown, that period of time between about 1906 to 1960s, people were not practicing herbalism. We lost that lineage, that history, that knowledge of the past, that herbalism throughout the last 2,000 years has been very much practiced by Christian men and women. I didn't lose it because I grew up in the Appalachians, where people are very religious, very devout, and still practice herbal medicine. But many, many people writing from the 70s to the present day write a lot about fairies and witches and magic spells and all kinds of stuff like that that really have no basis in reality. The documentation of history does not bear them out. Maybe people who have two-way conversations with plants and see fairies have a special source of knowledge that I don't know about. But having read literally hundreds of books on this subject, the history that they're writing about, the traditions that they're writing about, are often little more than folk tales when we've actually got volumes, volumes, dozens, hundreds of books on the progression of herbal medicine, you know, from ancient Egypt and Babylon, Mesopotamia, through Greece and Rome, and up into the German tradition and the Irish tradition and the English tradition. And yes, it is absolutely Christian medicine. And the lady who reminded us all of this, and the one to whom we can attribute so much of the resurgence of the German folk medicine in the 70s and 80s, was Maria Trebin. Maria Trebin, absolutely wonderful lady, Austrian. She wrote about the German folk medicine. She wrote about Father Nape's water cure. Had she not written about Father Kunzel, I would not have even known the man existed. And I read a lot of books, but I only found out about his work through her. Her books, Health Through God's Pharmacy, Help from God's Garden. There was another one she wrote that I think was even more popular, are excellent books. They are full books of herbs, herbal cures, anecdotes of how she used them to treat herself and other people and her family members, full color illustrations to help you go out in the wilderness and find these herbs. Fun to read her books. They're the very when someone asks me what's the first book you'd recommend for someone getting into herbal medicine, I always say, well, obviously I got to put a plug in for my books like Herbal Medicine for Preppers, Homesteaders, and Permaculture People. But no doubt, get yourself a used copy, cheap, of one of Maria Trevin's books. Put it on your shelf. Let it be the first thing you grab whenever you have an issue, whenever you get sick, whenever you need an herb, because she knew her stuff. She knew her stuff very well. It's through Maria Trevin that I learned about Hildegard von Bingen, Saint Hildegard. It's through Maria Trevin that I learned about Swedish bitters. Again, she was a little controversial at the time. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, there were people trying to shut her up. The medical establishment did not appreciate her. But she became world famous through those books, and they are firmly rooted, and I absolutely highly recommend them. Now, there's one other culture I'm going to speak of before I wrap this show up. It is French. Now, you've got to wonder, if you're going through the history of herbal medicine, why is it so infrequent that the herbal traditions of France is mentioned? I mean, France during several hundred years was the center of knowledge and education in the entire civilized world. After the fall of Rome, books and universities went to Ireland. That was the center of knowledge in the entire world. There's a great book out there called How the Irish Saved Civilization, although they make some claims that are absolutely fallacious and they could not be proven. Um, it's still a good book of history if you pay attention to what's factual and documented. That's where we find our first patron saint of herbal medicine, Saint Fiacre. That was the center of knowledge until it moved to Germany, essentially, for a time. Vikings kept raiding Ireland, and for a period of time, the center of knowledge moved out of Ireland. But it really did settle in France. I mean, that's where you had the great cathedrals, that's where you had the great universities, that's where you had the great museums, and you did have a very rich tradition and history of herbal medicine. The French herbal medicine was very likely as advanced or more advanced of any herbal tradition in its time. What happened? Why is it so hard to find herbal books written by the French? Well, it was the French Revolution. At about the time America was establishing our independence for people to live free and have property rights and live as they please and have religious freedom and all that, there was a very, very different revolution going on in France. It was the rise of the progressives. It was the rise of, they call it the era of reason. It's the rise of what would become communism. They slaughtered everybody. I mean, it started as the lower class rioting for food because they were in a bad time, and the upper class was really didn't care about them whatsoever. Everybody knows the history. Let them eat cake, the whole bit. Um, the streets of Paris ran with blood. They beheaded the priests, they beheaded the monks, they raped the nuns and then killed them. They set up the goddess of reason on the altar in Notre Dame Cathedral. Everyone that had property was essentially killed. Everyone that had money in the bank was killed. Everyone that had an education and was not allied with the revolutionaries was killed. They slaughtered everybody. They burned books. They burned entire libraries. All those medical books that were likely written by monks in France about how to treat people with herbs burned. It was a war not against the wealthy, it was a war against the religious. Eventually, the educated men who sided with the revolutionaries were themselves killed for not being radical enough. I mean, the French Revolution is not taught as it should be in our schools. People actually still think that, the French Revolution was a good thing. I just heard a newscaster on, I think it was Newsmax. Yeah, I think it was Newsmax TV. I mean, very conservative leaning network where someone should know better, saying that this was a few months ago that we should celebrate Bastille Day because without that we wouldn't have the French Revolution and freedom in France. No, there was no freedom in France. You were not free to be a practicing Christian of any denomination. You are not free to own your property for during this period. You are not free to own your own possessions. You are not free to defend yourself or your family. They slaughtered people to the point that the streets ran with blood, and they wiped out, for the most part, 1,000 years of history, and then rebuilt it in their own image. The Overton window. This was the beginning of the progressive movement that would become the Bolsheviks in Russia, that would become the Maoists in China, that would become, the Castros of Cuba, and the progressive liberal Democrats who um, kill about 16 million babies a year in America through abortion. This is the same people who would be Margaret Sanger, who, Hillary Clinton's hero, who advocated exterminating all blacks and Jews, or George Bernard Shaw, who came up with the idea for the gas chamber that was used by Hitler. These are the people that would become Hitler. And yeah, there's nothing good about the French Revolution. If you think the rise of Anglicanism in England was bloody and awful, you really haven't read the history of the French Revolution, which was absolutely deplorable. So, but how do we know there was a great history of herbalism in France? It comes down to a man named Maurice Messague. Maurice Messague became world famous in the 1970s, although you've probably not heard of him now. Let's just say 1950s through 70, more like the 60s. He came from a little village. His father was an herbalist. His father was someone like Eull Gibbons who just wanted to roam the woods. But people came to him, even though they thought he was lazy and crazy and everything, he could heal people. He used herbs to heal people. It was his family tradition. They were way out in the countryside. He continued to practice herbs as his family had done for generations. And Maurice grew up wandering the woods with his father, learning how to use herbs to heal people. Well, his family at the time, I mean, you got to remember, this is France. It was not fashionable to be religious. It was not acceptable, really, to be an independent thinker, if you would, unless you were, a secular artist in Paris. To be a traditional country Catholic was definitely frowned upon. Their design for him was to go to school, get a good education, and become a bureaucrat. They just wanted to sit in an office somewhere and push papers around. It was really considered like the highest thing you can be, right? I mean, in a progressive society, to be a bureaucrat is to be next best thing to being the president. DOT, the person that hands out the driver's license. That's your goal in life. That's stability. That's benefits. Not like his father, who was considered a layabout. Well, he did that. He went and he became a teacher, and that was considered, good enough. Well, he started teaching at boarding school. Now, the kids come into the boarding schools, and they're not being fed very well. They're getting sick, and he starts treating with herbs. The kids start bringing in their parents. Suddenly, he's a celebrated herbalist. The headmaster of the school finds out, fires and kicks him out, and says, he's lucky he doesn't get charged for practicing herbal medicine without a license. Herbal medicine had been absolutely made illegal in France. With the rise of the bureaucratic state, by the early 1900s at least, and probably going much further back, herbal medicine was illegal. Well, he got pretty offended. He decided it was his family's legacy to practice herbal medicine. And so he goes and he hangs out a shingle and he starts trying to get people in there. Nobody would show up. Nobody wanted to go to an herbalist. It was so far out of the mainstream in what, for some reason we in the Western world think of an open-minded, enlightened culture. No, it was illegal and he was going broke fast. He actually had to go work as an unlicensed bellhop. They haven't even had unionized bellhops. I mean, that's how, bureaucratic the society was and still is. He ends up eating in soup kitchens. He befriends a beggar who was a wino. He carried his bottle with him everywhere, and he had terrible eczema. Maurice says to him, I can treat that. I can cure it. He says, oh, I've been to doctors. No one can treat me. He said, no, not interested. Just go away. Maurice actually had to bribe his first patient by his first client, I should say, by giving him wine. In trade for a bottle of wine each day, he allowed him to treat him with herbal medicine, and his eczema went away. The man was, homeless. He was being cared for he was sleeping in a homeless shelter run by a church. And the nuns were amazed. They had tried everything and nothing was helping. All manner of doctors had come in there and done their charitable, hour of service a week, and they could not cure him. So the Mother Superior, she has an issue. She comes to Maurice. Maurice cured her. Doctors had not been able to cure her. His herbs cured her. He makes other recommendations. Now priests are starting to come to him. Now nuns and monks are starting to come to him. They're telling their parishioners about him. Soon, the wealthiest people in France were coming to him for cures. Movie stars, great movie stars, musicians, even the president of France, generals. He ended up treating the royal family of England. He treated people from all over the world. He was the absolute star of his day. He was featured in magazines and newspapers and television. If you were around in the 1950s and 60s, the name Maurice Messague was like a household word. He was absolutely world famous. But every single year, he was brought up on charges of practicing medicine without a license. Every single year, he was dragged into court. He had to keep lawyers on staff. Even princesses and princes would go in and testify on his behalf. They never made him stop, although other herbalists in France were prosecuted and charged and put in jail. By the time they caught him, he had such influence they could not imprison him. But still, even as popular and famous as he became, practicing herbal medicine did not become legal in France during his lifetime. That is why it is so hard to find a good French herbal. The bureaucratic state that began in the blood of the French Revolution makes sure that only the doctors licensed by the state could treat patients. We have come so close to that in America so many times, and it has only been through the dedicated hard work of Christian herbalists that we've been able to keep that freedom. That is the message I wanted to convey in this book. That's why I thought it was important to read, that we have to hold on to that history that so many people fought so hard for. And we have to stand up for it boldly. We need to influence our legislators to make laws that allow for natural medicine and never allow it to be outlawed, because we came that close. All right, y'all. Have a great week. Enjoy this beautiful weather. If it's sunny where you are, if it's warm, please continue to pray for Ukraine. I haven't heard from my friend there in several days, and as she lives in Odessa, which is being absolutely bombarded and leveled by the Russians right now, I don't have a good feeling about things. So prayers, please, for Ukraine. It's actually interesting if you want to look up. Interested, look up Fatima. In Fatima, the Mother of God appeared several times and gave information, prophecies, you would almost say, to three small children. And one of the things she said is if Russia isn't stopped, they would destroy the world, they would destroy nations. And she asked people to pray that Russia would be dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I know that's an odd request if you're a Protestant. It's pretty commonplace for Catholics to talk about such things, but Protestants don't. Just remember, no one turns down their own mother. When your mother asks you to do something, you do it. If you are of a mind, check out the Visions at Fatima. If you are comfortable asking saints to pray along with you, you don't actually pray to a saint, you pray with a saint. You ask a saint to pray for you. If you're not comfortable with that at all, I totally understand. Please just say prayers for Ukraine. Absolutely say prayers for Ukraine. mind, check out what's called the Divine Mercy Chaplet. Through a series of visions, there was a nun named Sister Faustina, and she was told if people would pray this specific prayer, um, Eternal Father, I offer you the body and blood, soul and division of your dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, in atonement for our sins and those of the whole world, that he would stop wars. They said she was told by angels and saints and everything that if, and Jesus himself appeared to her and spoke to her, that if people would pray that prayer, wars could be stopped. Every day at 3 p.m., I am getting on my knees and saying the Divine Mercy Chaplet for several intentions, but especially to end this war in Ukraine. And if you're comfortable, I hope you will join me in that. 3 p.m. wherever you are. That's in tradition. That was the time our Lord died on the cross. So y'all have a good week, and stay positive and stay hopeful. Never give up hope. The information in this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or condition. Nothing I say or write has been evaluated or approved by the FDA. I'm not a doctor. The U.S. government does not recognize the practice of herbal medicine, and there is no governing body regulating herbalists. Therefore, I'm really just a guy who studies herbs. I'm not offering any advice. I won't even claim that anything I write or say is accurate or true. I can tell you what herbs have been traditionally used for. I can tell you my own experience and if I believe an herb has helped me. I cannot nor would I tell you to do the same. If you use an herb anyone recommends, you are treating yourself. You take full responsibility for your health. Humans are individuals and no two are identical. What works for me may not work for you. You may have an allergy, a sensitivity, an underlying condition that no one else even shares and you don't even know about. Be careful with your health. By continuing to listen to my podcast or read my blog, you agree to be responsible for yourself, do your own research, make your own choices, and not to blame me for anything ever.